What did it feel like to stand on a lonely stretch of the French coast on the morning of June 6, 1944, and watch more than 7,000 Allied ships gather on the horizon? What went through the mind of a German officer who suddenly realized the greatest armada in human history was aimed directly at him, and that nothing, neither concrete, nor steel, nor orders from Berlin, was going to stop it? And what does a moment like that teach us about the collapse of confidence, the weight of responsibility, and the instant someone understands a war has just slipped beyond their nation's control? He was one of many, but his experience captures a truth shared across the Atlantic Wall, that the men observing D-Day from the German side did not see an invasion, they saw inevitability. They felt the ground shift beneath them long before the first Allied soldiers stepped ashore. And as the fog lifted and the scale of the armada revealed itself, many knew their war, whatever they believed it to be, had just ended. The story begins in the silence before dawn, with a man listening to the sea and realizing the sea was trying to warn him. He had been awake since 2:00 a.m., long before the first coded messages crackled across German wireless networks and long before the coastal batteries opened fire into the dark. Major Werner Pluskat of the 352nd Infantry Division, an officer with years of service behind him, stood alone near his observation post on the bluffs behind Omaha Beach. The night should have been quiet, but it wasn't. Something felt wrong, and he sensed it the way veterans do, not through logic, but through the instincts sharpened by every campaign he had survived. Pluskat had been ordered to rotate his artillery battalion away from fixed positions to avoid Allied bombing. His guns, like much of the division, were scattered, more mobile, but also harder to coordinate. He knew the 352nd was overstretched, responsible for a sector far too large for its strength. He also knew that Berlin remained convinced Normandy was a diversion. The real invasion, Hitler insisted, would come at Pas-de-Calais, but as he scanned the darkness offshore, he wondered how many warnings a commander needed before admitting the truth. Even the sea had a sound that night, distant, uneven, rhythmic, not waves, engines. It would be hours before he fully understood what those vibrations meant, but standing there, teeth clenched, listening to the deep mechanical heartbeat of something immense, he sensed the invasion was already underway. He simply couldn't yet see it, and that eerie, invisible presence hung over him like a storm waiting to break. Shortly before dawn, Pluskat climbed into his Kubelwagen and drove toward his forward observation post, a battered concrete bunker overlooking the beach. The roads were muddy, the trees torn by months of Allied air attacks. He passed exhausted sentries rubbing sleep from their eyes, and men pulling on helmets with the resignation of soldiers who knew something was coming, they just didn't know when. When he finally reached the bunker and stepped inside, the air was damp, the telephones dead more often than alive, and the view out the narrow slit was nothing but black water. He looked again through his binoculars, straining for movement, and then faintly he saw lights, not stars, not villages, but small, drifting lights on the horizon. At first he thought they might be fishing boats or patrol craft, but then more appeared, and more, and more. By the time the sky began to pale, the entire horizon was lined with silhouettes. He lifted the binoculars again and froze. He had seen ships before, light convoys, naval task forces, troop transports, but nothing prepared him for this. It was as if the ocean itself had turned to metal. Countless ships, LCTs, LSTs, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, slayered in depth so vast he couldn't count them. Some later estimates would place over 7,000 vessels in the assault fleet. At that moment, Pluskat couldn't have estimated even a fraction of them. He could only whisper the truth that settled like lead in his stomach. The Allies had come in force, not seen in any age of human conflict. A fleet that large did not come to test defenses, it came to break them. As the armada organized itself, the first flashes began, sharp, white bursts along the decks of Allied warships. A second later, the ground around Pluskat shook. Naval shells screamed overhead, shattering the morning calm, smashing into German positions all along the coast. The bunker trembled with each impact, dust falling from the ceiling in fine powdery sheets. Pluskat pressed his back to the wall, steadying himself, listening to the concussive booms roll across the bluffs. The observers shouted coordinates. Telephones rang hopelessly. Wires were cut. Artillery crews tried to reach headquarters only to hear static. The Allied preparatory barrage wasn't just targeting guns, it was dismantling the German command structure piece by piece. Every few minutes, shockwaves rippled through the ground as Allied naval guns, some with barrels larger than a man's chest, fired in relentless rhythm. Pluskat stepped back to the viewing slit, blinking dust from his eyes. The horizon flickered with muzzle flashes. Ships were advancing, closing in, forming assault waves. Behind them, columns of landing craft moved in perfect order, like rows of teeth closing in on the shore. He remembered reading reports about Allied production, how American shipyards were launching vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. He remembered hearing rumors that Britain's dockyards had been operating around the clock since 1940. But statistics, he realized, did not prepare a man for the sight of thousands of ships advancing toward him in one unstoppable mass. This was not strategy. This was industrial civilization transformed into a weapon. And as he watched, a terrible clarity settled over him. The Atlantic Wall had never been built to stop something like this. The first Allied aircraft appeared overhead soon after, waves of bombers and fighter bombers streaking across the sky, their engines drowning out the surf. They struck at road junctions, artillery positions, troop concentrations. Some bombs missed their marks, exploding deep inland. Others landed close enough to shake Pluskat's bunker like a toy. German anti-aircraft fire arced upward, but it was scattered, fragmented. Every gun crew that fired revealed its position to destroyers waiting offshore. The moment a flak battery opened up, a rain of naval shells answered. Some historians would later note that Allied naval fire was so precise, so overwhelming, that many German strongpoints never even had time to react before being neutralized. Pluskat watched helplessly as the coastal batteries tried and failed to match the Allied tempo. Battery Point du Hoc struggled to respond, firing sporadically. The Merville battery to the east, attacked by British paratroopers hours earlier, was compromised. Everywhere he looked, German defenses were being isolated, suppressed, or blinded. He could do little more than record what he saw and pray anyone could hear him through the failing phone lines. But deep down, he already knew the truth. No message he sent would change what was happening. When the first wave of landing craft approached Omaha Beach, Pluskat leaned forward, unable to look away. The sea churned with movement, LCA troop carriers, amphibious tanks, engineer craft, and assault boats pushing through the swells. The closer they came, the clearer their lines grew. Ranks of infantry crouched low, faces tense, rifles ready. Many were young, too young for a place like this. But they advanced with determination born not of confidence, but of necessity. Behind them, in the ships still farther out, he knew tens of thousands more were preparing to launch. He had read Allied doctrine, he understood the principles of amphibious assault, but seeing it unfold in real time was different. He watched the landing craft approach the zone where German machine guns and mortar waited. He knew the kill zones, the range arcs, the fire patterns. He had helped map them, and he knew exactly what would happen when those ramps dropped. Yet as he watched the enormity of the armada behind them, he also knew something else, something harder to admit. Even if every gun on the Atlantic Wall fired perfectly, even if every bunker held, even if every Allied landing craft was met with devastating fire, there were too many ships, too many men, too much industrial momentum behind the attack. The invasion could be bled, it could be delayed, but it could not be stopped. The Allied bombardment paused briefly, a deceptive, unnatural calm. Then, with a clang and a crash, the first ramps dropped. American infantry surged forward, stumbling into chest-deep water, bullets snapping around them, shells erupting along the sand. Pluskat watched tracer fire cut through the surf, watched men fall, watched others push on through instinct alone. It was chaos, smoke, fire, and bodies tossed by the tide. Omaha was becoming what historians would later call one of the most brutal battlefields of the war. German veterans manned the defenses, firing with grim efficiency. The terrain, shingle bluffs, interlocking fields of fire favored the defenders completely. For the men coming ashore, every step felt like an eternity. Pluskat found himself torn between duty and horror. These were enemy soldiers, yes, but they were also men fighting against impossible odds, advancing into the teeth of fortified positions that had been waiting for them for months. He had fought on the Eastern Front. He had seen brutal battles, but the courage required to walk straight into a storm like this struck him in a way he did not expect. He kept watching, because he had to. And the more he watched, the more he sensed that sheer bravery, multiplied across thousands, was beginning to tilt the balance. As the morning progressed, the German tactical map dissolved into confusion. Reports came in sporadically, devastating in their implications. WN strongpoints being overrun, communications collapsing, reinforcements blocked by Allied air power, divisional headquarters struggling to determine which units were still intact. Pluskat tried to direct fire. He tried to call in support, but with each passing minute, control slipped further out of his hands. The 352nd Infantry Division was fighting valiantly, but it was fighting blind. And the more he observed, the more he realized that German doctrine built on speed, coordination, and maneuver was collapsing beneath the weight of Allied supremacy in every domain. He saw American engineers blow gaps in the obstacles. He saw infantry crawl forward under fire, inch by inch, until they reached the base of the bluffs. He saw naval gunfire shift its focus, hammering the highest points of resistance. And then he saw, to his astonishment, small groups of Americans claw their way up the ravines, scaling the cliffs under fire. This was not just bravery, it was inevitability given human form. He turned from the viewing slit, dust settling on his uniform, and knew the moment the line had been broken. By late morning, the tide of battle had shifted. The Americans had reached the top of the bluffs in multiple sectors. German machine gun nests found themselves attacked from behind. Mortar crews, running low on ammunition, were forced to relocate or surrender. The carefully planned kill zones that had held back the first waves were unraveling as Allied infantry spread across the high ground. Pluskat could still hear gunfire, but it had changed tone from thunderous coordinated volleys to scattered pockets of resistance. The German defense was fracturing, its positions isolated. Somewhere inland, the remnants of the 352nd Division were trying to mount counterattacks, but they were too few, too disorganized, and too exposed to Allied aircraft. He realized, with a cold weight settling in his chest, that the battle for Normandy had already been decided hours earlier, when the first ships appeared on the horizon. Everything since had been men fighting bravely in the shadow of an outcome that industrial might and strategic planning had already sealed. He had witnessed invasions before. He had studied military history, but he had never seen a moment where one man standing on a cliff with binoculars could watch the fate of continents unfolding right in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to change it. In the early afternoon, Pluskat received orders to withdraw his observation team. The Americans were closing in, and the bunker was now dangerously exposed. He stepped outside, blinking into the sunlight. Smoke curled from shattered fortifications. The air smelled of cordite, seawater, and burned earth. The sky buzzed with Allied planes circling overhead. He looked one last time at Omaha Beach. The tide had receded, revealing wrecked landing craft and bodies scattered along the sand. But beyond that, he saw waves of men, vehicles, and equipment pouring ashore: bulldozers, tanks, artillery, ammunition, trucks, medics, signal teams, engineers. The beach was transforming by the minute from a battlefield into a logistical artery. This, he realized, was the true power of the invasion. Not the violence, not the explosions, not even the courage of the first waves. It was the relentless, unbroken flow of reinforcements and supplies that stretched to the horizon. No nation fighting alone could match it. No defensive line could endure it. He turned away, understanding that he had just witnessed the moment Germany's war became unwinnable. He climbed into his vehicle, driving inland along roads cratered by bombs, past fields burning from naval fire. He felt strangely calm, not in acceptance, but in recognition. The war he had believed in, the war he had trained for, the war he had been ordered to hold at all costs, had been overtaken by the raw reality of Allied strength. Hours later, as he regrouped with remnants of his division, he carried the memory of that morning with him. Many German officers who witnessed the landings reported similar feelings: shock, dread, awe. Some would later admit that when they saw the armada, they knew instantly the war was lost. Others tried to convince themselves it was only the beginning of a long struggle. But Pluskat and men like him understood what the sight of those 7,000 ships truly meant. They weren't watching a battle. They were watching the inevitable triumph of a coalition that had fused industrial power, logistical planning, and human determination into a force no defensive line could resist. And for the rest of their lives, the officers who stood on those cliffs would remember the moment the horizon turned to steel, and the invasion became unstoppable. He did not sleep that night, nor the night after. Few German officers in Normandy did. The shock of what they had witnessed on D-Day was not something the human mind processed quickly. It lingered, quiet, heavy, impossible to ignore. And for Major Werner Pluskat, the images returned unbidden. The endless mass of ships, the thunder of naval guns, the slow, inexorable crawl of Allied troops across the bluffs he once believed unassailable. Yet the war did not end on June 6. For the men on both sides, that day was merely the opening act of a brutal, grinding campaign. Pluskat, his division shattered and scattered, found himself thrust into a desperate fight for survival, one that unfolded across hedgerows, villages, and blood-soaked fields. If D-Day was the moment he realized the invasion was unstoppable, then the days that followed taught him why it was irresistible. As the smoke settled over Omaha, the German army faced a truth it was not prepared to confront. The enemy had come ashore firmly, massively, and with a momentum no counterattack could erase. And the battle for Normandy was about to become even worse. The morning after D-Day dawned gray and heavy, the sky thick with a lingering scent of smoke and damp soil. Pluskat stood amid what remained of the 352nd Infantry Division as officers attempted to reconstruct something resembling a command structure. Names were shouted, units hastily reorganized, casualty lists growing by the hour. Some companies had been reduced to mere handfuls of exhausted, mud-covered survivors. Others had simply ceased to exist. The division headquarters, stunned by the scale of the previous day's events, issued urgent instructions for counterattacks, because they believed the attacks could succeed, but because doctrine demanded it. German tactics in both world wars emphasized immediate, aggressive counterblows to regain lost ground. But doctrine had been written in another era, under different skies, and certainly not for a battlefield where Allied aircraft patrolled endlessly. Pluskat listened as the orders poured in, the voices tense, the messages fragmented. The Germans were to push the Americans back into the sea, an objective so unrealistic it bordered on delusion. The generals may have believed reports from some sectors that the Allies had suffered catastrophic losses, but Pluskat had seen the inland tide with his own eyes. Behind those first waves lay multiple divisions already landing with increasing efficiency. The Americans had turned chaos into order with alarming speed. Still, the counterattacks went forward, because refusing them would have been unthinkable. And so, the remnants of the 352nd moved inland to face an enemy that held not just the beaches but the skies, the sea, and soon, the very terrain itself. By June 8, Pluskat found himself navigating the Bocage country Normandy's infamous maze of hedgerows that turned each field into a fortress. Dense ancient earth walls topped with tangled roots and vegetation created natural defensive barriers, perfect for ambushes, but nightmarish for maneuvering. Every hedgerow was a potential death trap, every lane twisted unpredictably. A division could vanish into the greenery and never re-emerge in one piece. Pluskat, a trained artillery officer, had never fought in terrain like this. On the Eastern Front, battlefields unfolded in vast, open vista spaces where artillery could dominate the horizon. Here, visibility was measured in meters. Guns that once could strike targets kilometers away now struggled to fire without hitting hedgerows 20 meters in front of them. Allied spotter planes, circling effortlessly overhead, spotted every German battery that dared reveal itself. And when they did, naval artillery from miles offshore responded with terrifying precision. The Germans had never expected to fight in terrain that robbed them of their greatest strengths. For decades, their doctrine had celebrated maneuver warfare, speed, flexibility, initiative. In Normandy, every movement was slow, exposed, and vulnerable. The Americans, learning rapidly, used the hedgerows to creep forward methodically, building fire superiority with machine guns, tanks, and mortar. Pluskat watched as small German counterattacks, brave, desperate assaults led by battle-hardened veterans, were shredded by Allied firepower. The Germans fought with their characteristic tenacity, yet every hour revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Allies could replace their losses. The Germans could not. It was the same realization he had felt on Didab. Now it was unfolding inch by inch, hedgerow by hedgerow, in excruciating slow motion. By June 10th, the German High Command still clung to the fantasy that Normandy was a holding action until the real invasion appeared further north. Hitler refused to allow the panzer reserves to move freely. Rommel argued that tanks must be positioned close to the front to strike Allied forces early, before they built overwhelming strength. Von Rundstedt, older and far more pragmatic, favored strategic withdrawal to fight a mobile defense. Berlin, disconnected from reality, overruled them all. Pluskat, observing the battlefield firsthand, saw what those arguments looked like in practice: chaos. The 21st Panzer Division, ordered into fragmented attacks without air cover, was mauled. The elite Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armored formations Germany possessed, suffered severe losses from Allied air power before its tanks even reached the front line. And every time a German unit tried to regroup, Allied reconnaissance aircraft would circle above like silent predators, directing artillery, bombers, or naval fire. For Pluskat, the most frustrating part was not the violence, it was the futility. The Germans fought with the bravery of men defending their homeland, but they were shackled by indecision at the top, constant interference from Berlin, and a complete lack of understanding about the industrial scale behind the Allied operation. Pluskat had understood it immediately when he saw the Armada. Now others were beginning to understand it too. The Allies weren't just fighting a battle, they were building a continent-wide logistic base on French soil, and the Germans were powerless to stop it. As the days rolled into weeks, Pluskat witnessed performances of astonishing courage on both sides. German infantrymen held ruined villages until they were reduced to ash and rubble. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed. Medics dragged wounded soldiers through thick hedgerows under fire. Officers rallied shattered battalions with voices hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. This was not an army that broke easily. It shattered only after being driven far beyond the limits of endurance. But for every German position that fought to the last, the Allies responded with something Germany could no longer match: resources. Fresh divisions arrived. New tanks rolled off landing craft. Aircraft carriers and battleships, offshore rotated crews, ammunition, and fuel with clockwork efficiency. American engineers pushed roads inland. British logistics teams built supply depots the size of small towns. The Mulberry Harbor at Ardennes, an artificial port engineered in secrecy, began, unloading thousands of tons of supplies per day. Pluskat watched a war machine assemble itself in real time, and the more he saw, the more he realized that even if Germany had fought flawlessly on June 6th, the outcome would have changed only in duration, not destiny. The Allies had not brought an invasion. They had brought a replacement for Europe's entire wartime industry, and they were now building it on French soil. By late June, the 352nd Infantry Division effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Its survivors, shattered, sleep-deprived, and malnourished, were merged into other units, forming ad hoc battle groups. Pluskat was reassigned to roles that shifted constantly: coordinating artillery when possible, serving as a liaison between retreating units, even taking up improvised defensive positions when needed. The chain of command, once rigid, now bent and twisted under the weight of reality. For Pluskat, the most haunting part was how predictable the collapse felt. He saw it in the faces of junior officers, men barely in their 20s, staring at their maps as if the lines themselves were dissolving. He saw it in the expressions of veteran NCOs, their confidence etched away day by day. He saw it in the frantic, often contradictory orders relayed from higher command: attacks that were impossible, withdrawals that came too late, defenses stretched beyond all logic. Every mile fought was a mile fought without hope of reinforcement. Every German soldier who fell was irreplaceable. Every Allied soldier who fell would be replaced by another ship docking the next morning. And through it all, Pluskat could not forget the armada he had seen on June 6th. That single image explained everything that followed. It was a truth so vast that the entire German army in Normandy was now living inside its shadow. They were fighting a nation, several nations whose combined industrial power dwarfed anything Germany could muster. And each day of combat in Normandy revealed that imbalance with increasing clarity. By early July, the battles intensified. The Americans fought through the bocage, employing new tactics. Tank infantry teams, bulldozers cutting paths through hedgerows, and explosive hedgerow cutters welded onto Sherman tanks. British and Canadian forces engaged in grueling offensives around Caen, each battle transforming the landscape into a wasteland of smoke, shattered stone, and burned-out vehicles. Pluskat, moving among shifting lines, found himself in the path of constant artillery fire. The sound became a permanent presence, never distant, never fully absent. It thudded against the earth at all hours, day and night. He learned to distinguish the cracks of American 105mm shells from the deeper pound of British 25-pounders. He grew used to the hum of aircraft overhead, the whistle of rockets, the sudden, devastating impact of naval bombardment whenever the front approached the coast. In quieter moments, he thought of the soldiers who had manned the bunkers on D-Day, many of them young, many of them asking the same unanswerable question: how could they hope to stop something so vast? Now, weeks later, the answer was even clearer than before. They couldn't. But they fought anyway, not because they believed they would win, but because the alternative was inconceivable. On July 18th, Operation Goodwood began, one of the largest armored assaults ever undertaken by British forces. Hundreds of tanks advanced across the plains east of Caen. The ground shook under their treads, German defenses stiffened. Anti-tank guns fired until they were destroyed in place. Luftwaffe support was minimal, its strength eroded by years of attrition. Pluskat, now serving with an ad hoc artillery group, watched the smoke rising over the battlefield. Goodwood was a demonstration of Allied power, but also of German resilience. British and Canadian forces advanced, but the Germans held portions of the line with tenacity that surprised even their enemies. Yet for all the German bravery, Pluskat recognized a deeper truth. Battles like Goodwood revealed a pattern. The Allies attacked relentlessly, probing the line, wearing it down. The Germans resisted fiercely, but each defense cost them irreplaceable men, irreplaceable equipment, irreplaceable time. Strength was becoming a memory. Effort was becoming desperation. And the Allies were still building up every day, every hour, every tide. By late July, the German situation collapsed once more. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, began on July 25th. A carpet of bombs fell on German positions, obliterating defensive lines and sowing chaos. Survivors stumbled from craters, dazed, their units annihilated before the battle even began. American forces surged forward, not cautiously but with explosive momentum. Pluskat heard the reports with growing dread. German units weren't just bending, they were breaking apart. Tanks bogged down or destroyed by air power. Infantry cut off by roads jammed with refugees, vehicles, and retreating soldiers. The Americans were not merely advancing, they were flooding into the French countryside like a breached dam. The German command reacted with alarm, issuing frantic orders designed to restore the line, but every counterattack failed. Every reserve committed was swallowed instantly by the momentum of the American assault. For Pluskat, it felt like watching the inevitable end of a long, painful unraveling. Everything that had begun the moment he saw that armada on DID was now reaching its climax. Germany had gambled its future on holding Normandy. Now Normandy, at last, was breaking free. As August approached, Pluskat found himself among the remnants of units retreating toward the Falaise region. The German army, stretched thin and surrounded by converging Allied forces, was spiraling toward catastrophe. The pocket was closing, a noose of steel tightening around tens of thousands of German soldiers. He sensed the end of the campaign in every exhausted face he passed. Officers directed traffic with trembling hands, medics worked in ditches. Ammunition was scarce. Fuel was almost non-existent. Vehicles were abandoned by the hundreds. Horses, once symbols of a bygone era, returned to the forefront, pulling carts loaded with wounded men. The Allies pressed relentlessly. Canadian forces advanced from the north. American divisions surged from the south. British units struck from the west. Resistance hardened at points, but not enough to halt the encirclement. Pluskat narrowly escaped the Falaise pocket with his life, one of the lucky few who slipped through the closing gap at Chem. Maps drawn after the war would show the pocket tightening like a trap. But Pluskat didn't need a map. He felt it in his bones. He felt it in every step across the muddy roads, every sound of artillery behind him, every column of smoke rising from wrecked German columns. Normandy was lost. Germany's last realistic chance to halt the Western Allies had died on those beaches and in the weeks of relentless fighting that followed. As the sun set on the final days of the Normandy campaign, Pluskat paused on a ridge overlooking the countryside. Fields burned in the distance. Columns of retreating soldiers moved along the roads. The air was heavy with dust and smoke, the sky streaked red by the fading light of another day lost to war. He thought back to June 6th. The morning he saw 7,000 Allied ships spread across the horizon like a wall of iron. In that moment he had understood the truth instantly and viscerally. Germany could not win. The invasion was not simply powerful, it was unstoppable. But only now, after weeks of fighting, retreating, and witnessing the collapse of everything his army had built, did he understand fully what unstoppable meant. It meant not just overwhelming numbers or firepower, it meant a coalition united by purpose, supplied by vast industrial might, advancing with precision and determination. It meant a logistical miracle unfolding in real time. It meant a war Germany had started but could no longer hope to control. And it meant the beginning of the end, not just for the German army in France, but for the entire Third Reich. As he watched the last light fade over the ruined fields of Normandy, Pluskat realized that history would look back on what he had seen that morning not as a battle but as a turning point, one that had reshaped the fate of nations. And he had witnessed it from the very moment the horizon turned to steel. He would carry Normandy with him long after the smoke cleared. For Major Werner Pluskat and for countless German officers who survived the campaign, the memories did not fade with time. They hardened, they deepened, they became quiet truths a man remembers not because he wants to, but because they shaped the person he became. And years later, when historians interviewed veterans from both sides, a common understanding emerged. Something fundamental had shifted in those fields and hedgerows. Something larger than armies, larger than strategy, larger even than the war itself. Pluskat didn't yet know what the final year of the conflict would look like. But as he marched eastward with the remnants of the German forces retreating from Normandy, he already sensed what historians would later confirm. The Third Reich had begun its irreversible descent. The defeat in France was not merely a battlefield loss, it was a strategic and psychological unraveling, a collapse set in motion the moment those thousands of Allied ships appeared on the horizon. And the further he traveled from Normandy, the more he felt that moment following him like a shadow. The retreat across France was chaotic, far more chaotic than the German military would ever acknowledge in official reports. The roads were choked with every imaginable vehicle. Staff cars, carts pulled by horses, motorcycles sputtering with their last drops of fuel, tanks limping forward on failing engines. Wounded men leaned against trucks, stragglers joined columns at random. Officers waved their arms in futile attempts to restore order, but the retreat had a life of its own. It moved not in formations, but in tides. Pluskat rode in the back of a commandeered Kubelwagen, boots caked with mud, uniform torn, his mind replaying the sights of the previous weeks, passed through villages where civilians stared with a mixture of fear, anger, and relief. Fear that fighting might soon engulf their homes. Anger at the occupiers who had dominated their lives, and relief that liberation was finally sweeping across the countryside. Many Germans marched with their heads down. They knew the war was turning. They could feel France slipping away day by day. The cavalry of modern war was overhead. Allied fighter bombers roamed the skies, strafing vehicles, blasting bridges, cutting escape routes. Every time Pluskat heard the rising whistle of a diving aircraft, he flinched. Every German soldier did. The sound meant danger, instantaneous, merciless, impossible to resist. Some units traveled only at night, hiding in barns or woodlines during daylight hours to avoid becoming targets in the endless Allied air campaign. It was a new kind of war, one the Germans could not match. The harsh reality grew clearer with every mile. The Allies owned the sky. They owned the sea. They owned the initiative. And Germany, once feared for its precision and momentum, had become a force trying desperately not to be annihilated. As the retreat continued, Pluskat noticed something else, a shift in morale. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, like a candle burning low. Officers still issued orders, units still fought hard, but the belief had changed. The certainty that had fueled the early years of the war, the confidence that German arms could overcome any odds, had been eroded by the sheer scale of what they now faced. He remembered, years earlier, when victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans had created an aura of invincibility. He remembered the lightning-fast advances across the steppes of the Soviet Union, the belief that German strategy could overcome vast distances and larger armies. But Normandy was different. Normandy had exposed a truth Germany could no longer ignore. The Allies had surpassed them in production, coordination, firepower, and technology. And once the Western Allies gained a foothold, their advance would not stop. It couldn't stop. This realization did not demoralize him immediately. It slowly sank in as he passed through the ruins of German strongpoints, through destroyed villages, through endless columns of exhausted men. It sank in as he saw the wounded being evacuated by overworked medics. It sank in as he listened to the distant thunder of artillery growing louder from the west, not German guns, but Allied ones. Normandy had been a hinge point in the war, and it had turned decisively against Germany. Reaching the Seine River in late August, Pluskat witnessed scenes that would later become emblematic of the German retreat. Bridges blown to delay the advancing Allies, columns of tanks abandoned due to lack of fuel, engineers desperately laying explosives while artillery thundered behind them. The crossing points were clogged with units trying to escape encirclement. Some were turned back by officers attempting to maintain order. Others pushed forward in desperation. The river crossings marked more than a tactical withdrawal. They marked the collapse of Germany's hold over Western Europe. Behind them, Paris was rising in open resistance. Allied armored divisions surged forward with unprecedented speed, the British pushing northeast, the Canadians moving steadily into the Low Countries, the Americans racing toward Belgium at a pace few had imagined possible. Pluskat crossed the Seine at night under sporadic shellfire, the river glowing faintly in the moonlight. He stood on the far bank, dripping with sweat, chest heaving from exhaustion, and listened to the distant explosions behind him. For years, German forces had advanced east to west. Now they were fleeing west to east, and every step felt like a reminder of what had been lost. He knew the Allies would soon reach the German border, and he feared what would happen when they did. The retreat continued through northern France, through Belgium, through towns that had once celebrated German victories and now watched German soldiers pass with silent judgment. Posters once praising the Reich were torn down. Flags once hung in forced obedience were removed. Civilians stared openly, some relieved, some angry, some quietly hopeful. By September, Pluskat found himself near the Siegfried Line, Germany's fortified western border. It had been a symbol of strength once. Now it was a refuge, a final defensive barrier the Reich hoped would slow the Allied advance long enough to stabilize the front. He walked along bunkers built in the 1930s, their concrete weathered but still formidable. Engineers inspected them, artillery officers assessed fields of fire, infantrymen dug fresh trenches. There was brave talk of holding the line, of buying time, of making the Allies bleed for every kilometer. But Pluskat knew the truth. He had seen what was coming. He had seen 7,000 ships on the morning of D-Day. He had seen the might of Allied logistics. He had seen the sky darken with enemy aircraft. He had seen battalions shattered beyond recognition. And he knew the Siegfried Line could not hold indefinitely against an enemy that moved with such momentum. In October, Pluskat was reassigned once more, this time to help coordinate artillery for defensive operations as the Allies approached Germany's western frontier. The work was constant. Allied offensives battered the line with devastating firepower. German units, understrength and undersupplied, fought with grim determination, but each battle weakened them further. The American attacks near Aachen, the British operations near the Dutch border, the Canadian advance toward the Scheldt each tore pieces from the German defensive mosaic. Pluskat watched war transform landscapes once again, turning forests into splintered wastelands, turning villages into rubble, turning rivers into graves. He saw the same story unfold repeatedly. The Germans fought well, very well, but the Allies had depth Germany could not match. A regiment destroyed was replaced the next day. A German regiment destroyed was gone forever. And so the German defense stiffened but continued to shrink, like a fortress being eroded stone by stone. By November, Pluskat's world had become a blur of artillery maps, radio messages, and constant repositioning. The war was no longer a grand strategy of offensives and counteroffensives. It was now a grim struggle to delay the inevitable. The Allies were learning, adapting, coordinating with a precision that impressed even seasoned German veterans. They fought with combined arms warfare that rivaled anything Germany had once perfected. But perhaps the most dangerous weapon the Allies possessed was not a tank or a plane or a gun. It was certainty. The certainty of victory. The confidence of a force advancing on its own momentum. The knowledge that the world's factories were behind them. Meanwhile, Germany was fighting with the certainty of something else. The certainty of collapse. The certainty of dwindling fuel, ammunition, and manpower. The certainty that every retreat was permanent. Pluskat felt it in the cold November winds as he scanned the landscape through battered binoculars. The war had become unwinnable long before the Allies reached Germany. It had become unwinnable on June 6, when thousands of ships appeared on the horizon, and he realized the truth: the invasion was not merely an attack. It was the visible form of Germany's defeat. As winter approached, Pluskat and the remnants of the German forces prepared for defensive battles that would test them beyond anything Normandy had demanded. The Allies were advancing toward the Rhine, the great natural barrier of Germany. Rumors circulated, some optimistic, others bleak, but one truth dominated every conversation among officers who had witnessed Normandy firsthand. What was coming next would not reverse the course of the war. It would only delay the end. Pluskat knew this the way a man knows the inevitable shift of seasons. He had seen the beginning of the end on the morning of D-Day. And now, as the battered remnants of the Wehrmacht dug into the frozen earth, he understood that the war's final act was about to begin. But the story of the Reich's last gamble, the desperate winter offensive that would shock the Allies, stun the world, and push both forces into the most brutal fighting of the Western Front, was still to come. And Pluskat, battle-worn, exhausted, and carrying the weight of Normandy like a scar on his soul, was marching unknowingly toward the Battle of the Bulge. The winter of 1944 came early and came hard. Snow fell across the forests of the Ardennes in heavy, silent sheets, blanketing the landscape in white, soft, peaceful, almost serene. But beneath that stillness, thousands of German soldiers assembled in near total secrecy, Trucks crept along narrow forest roads under darkness. Tanks rumbled through the woods with branches tied to their hulls to disguise their silhouettes. Artillery units dug in under camouflage nets so thick they blended with the units spoke in hushed tones. Radios were silenced. Movements occurred only at night. Major Werner Pluskat, now assigned as an artillery coordinator for the coming operation, felt the eerie tension that hung over every campfire and briefing tent. The Ardennes offensive, what the German High Command called WWII am Rhein, was not just another attack, it was a gamble, a last attempt to change the war's direction, a final roll of the dice by a regime with no moves left. Pluskat read the operation plans by lantern light and understood immediately what so many other field officers saw. The objectives were ambitious to the point of impossibility. The German army, battered by months of retreat, was to smash through American lines, cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into political paralysis. It looked bold on paper. It looked desperate in reality. Still, orders were orders, and Pluskat had survived too long to mistake hope for strategy. He spent the nights before the attack coordinating with divisional artillery commanders, mapping out fire missions, marking priority targets, and ensuring communications ran through the labyrinth of forests. The offensive required perfect timing, perfect coordination, and winter, for the briefest moment, seemed to be on Germany's side. The heavy snow and thick fog grounded Allied aircraft. It was as if the sky itself had gone dark. For a fleeting moment, Pluskat allowed himself to wonder, could this actually work? On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 a.m., the silence of the Ardennes was shattered by the roar of thousands of German guns firing at once. The forest trembled. Trees splintered. Snow cascaded from branches in white clouds. For nearly 2 hours, the bombardment hammered American positions, catching many soldiers unprepared. Artillery, Germany's old, reliable strength, opened the offensive with brutal precision. Pluskat observed the opening salvo with mixed feelings. It was the most intense bombardment he had seen since Normandy. The ground shook beneath his boots. Fire missions overlapped with surgical efficiency. The sky glowed faintly orange through the fog as shells detonated along the American front lines. Then came the armored divisions. Then came the infantry. And to the disbelief of many, the German assault broke through. American units, stretched thin, inexperienced, and positioned in what the Allies believed was a quiet sector, fell back under the sudden onslaught. Convoys evacuated towns in chaos. Communications faltered. Roadblocks crumbled. For the first time since the invasion of Normandy, the Western Front cracked open. Pluskat moved with the advancing units, directing artillery along the flanks. He watched German tanks punch deep into the Ardennes, watched fuel trucks race ahead to keep the panzers moving, watched infantry push through towns whose names would soon become etched into history. Monchaux, St. Vith, Clairvaux. For 48 hours, disbelief mingled with exhilaration. It was happening. The offensive was working. The Allies were surprised, truly surprised. And for the first time since D-Day, the Germans were advancing toward the west. But victory in war is rarely determined by the first days of an offensive. On December 19th, as Pluskat coordinated fire missions near the outskirts of St. Vith, he noticed the first cracks. Fuel shortages slowed the advance. Roads became jammed with vehicles stuck behind tanks immobilized by ice or mechanical failure. Artillery units struggled to keep pace. Communications snarled as wires were cut by shell fire or buried in snow. Worse still, the fog began to lift. And when the sky cleared, the terrible truth returned. The Allies owned the air. The moment visibility improved, Allied fighter bombers swept over the Ardennes with ruthless efficiency. Panzers were struck one after another. Supply convoys were shredded. Road junctions became infernos of burning metal. Pluskat watched in frustrated fury as his meticulously prepared artillery positions were hit by swarms of aircraft he could do nothing to stop. The offensive slowed, then it bogged down. Then it bled. By late December, the German spearheads, exhausted, undersupplied, and facing growing resistance, struggled to maintain any momentum. American units, shaken at first, now rallied with staggering speed. Reinforcements flooded in. Fresh divisions took up blocking positions. Patton's Third Army pivoted north with incredible rapidity. The tide was shifting again, just as it had in Normandy. The bold advance that had once looked promising began to curl inward. The bulge in the Allied lines became a trap for the attackers. Pluskat saw it happening in real time. His artillery missions became defensive. Fire support shifted from enabling an advance to covering withdrawals. Radios filled with urgent requests from units running low on ammunition and fuel. The German army had thrown everything into the offensive, and everything was not enough. In early January, the cold deepened to unbearable levels. Snowdrifts rose higher than vehicles. Artillery shells froze to metal crates. Weapons jammed. Frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. Pluskat and his men held positions near La Roche, firing whenever they could, withdrawing when ordered, doing everything possible to delay the inevitable collapse. Some days he barely slept. Other days he walked among his men, cracking frozen ice from gun carriages with a hammer, trying to maintain an illusion of order. But the reality grew impossible to hide. The offensive was dying. The last fuel reserves were gone. The last fresh units were spent. The last hopes were fading. By mid-January, the Allies pushed with full strength, crushing the Bulge from north and south. German units fell back toward the Rhine, not in a panicked rout like the retreat from Normandy, but in a grim, exhausted, hopeless withdrawal. They knew this had been the last chance. The last moment Germany might have changed the outcome of the war. Pluskat stood on a ridge overlooking the forest once filled with confidence, secrecy, and ambition, now scarred with crater fields, burnt-out tanks, frozen bodies half buried in snow. He felt no shock, no anger, just a cold clarity. Normandy had marked the beginning of the end. The Ardennes had marked the confirmation of it. Germany would not recover from this blow. In February 1945, Pluskat crossed the Rhine with the remnants of his unit. The great river, once a symbol of defense, pride, and German strength, was now merely another boundary they were withdrawing behind. The West was lost. The Allies were coming. American divisions were preparing to cross into the heart of Germany. Pluskat walked in silence among his men, fewer than half the number he had commanded before the offensive. Many were wounded. Many were frostbitten. Many were simply worn down to the bone. He knew the war would not last much longer. He knew Germany would be invaded from east and west. He knew the end would be brutal. Years later, when he would speak of the war, Pluskat would describe D-Day as the moment he realized Germany could not win. But he described the Battle of the Bulge as the moment he realized Germany would not survive. One was the beginning. The other was the conclusion. The struggle in the Ardennes had been Germany's last gamble, and the gamble had failed. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Pluskat, exhausted, worn, and carrying memories heavier than any pack, emerged alive but changed. He returned to a homeland in ruins, 2 cities reduced to stone, to a nation grappling with the cost of its ambitions and the consequences of its leadership. He carried Normandy with him. He carried the Ardennes with him, and he carried the understanding that history often turns on moments that seem overwhelming when witnessed up close but become crystal clear in hindsight. For him, the turning point of the war had not been decided in Berlin's strategy rooms or Hitler's orders. It had been decided the moment he saw the Allied armada on the horizon on June 6, 1944, and everything afterward had been the long, painful unfolding of that truth. The war was over, but the memory never left.
If you've stayed to the end, you're one of the few who still wants the truth. Subscribe, and together, we'll uncover every secret the Second World War tried to keep buried.